Tina Turner asked,
Oh, what's love got to do with it?
Huey Lewis sang,
That's the power of love. That's the power of love.
the Beatles said,
All you need is love, love. Love is all you need.
Welcome to Loveland Bible Study. We have been walking through the book of 1 Corinthians over the last few months. Today, we are in chapter 13. So, why don't we get started by reading? Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become a sounding brass or clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all of my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, and does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Whether there is knowledge, it will vanish away. You know, I remember watching a movie some time ago about a grandmother teaching her granddaughter how to cook. And they were in the kitchen, and the grandmother was saying, you put a pinch of this and a pinch of that and a little of this and a little of that. And the granddaughter was trying to write everything down exactly. And so the grandmother wasn't measuring because she'd done it so many times and really knew what she was doing. But the granddaughter wanted measurements and all of those kinds of things. So they did their best to figure it out. And the granddaughter took the recipe home and she made it, and it was good. It really was good. But it didn't taste as good as her grandmother's. And so the granddaughter goes back to the grandmother and she says, look, I did everything you said. I did it just the way you said. I think I got the portions right, and everything that I put in there was the way it was supposed to be, but it just didn't taste as good as yours. The grandmother laughed a little and she said, sweetheart, the secret ingredient to this food that I make is love. You can get everything right. You can get all of the proportions right, every bit of the spices and the herbs and the flour and whatever else you're putting in there. You can get all of that just right. But it's not finished until you've added love to the mixture. She said, I've learned to to do this with love for my family, for all of these years. And honey, when you learn to do this with love, yours will taste better than mine. So the secret ingredient, according to Grandma, is love. Jesus said it like this. You remember in Matthew 22, where a lawyer comes to him and he says, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And I'm sure if you've been in the Bible at all, you remember what Jesus said to him. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second one is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So, we're here in the book of 1 Corinthians, and now we're at chapter 13. And we know what's happened up to this point, that Paul started this church in Corinth, and he stayed with them for a while, but then he left. And after he left, he heard that they were having some issues, so he writes a letter back to the people at Corinth that are new to following Jesus. He writes this letter to really help them to figure out what this walk with Jesus looks like in real life. And that's what I love about 1 Corinthians, and particularly these chapters we're in now, because he really gives us instructions about what believers should do and think and how we should act when it comes to representing our faith in Jesus and our own personal loving relationship with God. So here, this becomes the question after what Jesus said. What does it mean to love God? And what does it mean to love my neighbor? What does it mean to love God, and what does it mean to love people? So one of the things that Paul's doing here in this section of 1 Corinthians is he's helping us to see that we should be serving and building each other up. In chapter 12, when he talks about spiritual gifts, he's making it clear to us that these gifts aren't just for us and our benefit, because we do benefit from using the spiritual gifts that he gives us, but that those spiritual gifts are really intended to bless the body, to bless those around us. When we use our gifts, they're edified, they're built up, they're encouraged. But Paul recognizes that when we start using our gifts, there's this natural tendency, and it's part of our flesh makeup. It's who we are. There's this natural tendency to focus inward, to focus on ourselves. Now remember, Paul's idea and Jesus's idea of love is upward toward God and outward towards people. And our tendency is to begin to look inward. And we start to think about how everything is about us, how everything benefits us, how everything that I have is really first for me, is the way we naturally think. And that causes us to get a little puffed up and a little selfish and a little self-centered, if I could say it like that. It reminds me of the story of the rabbi in a synagogue, and the rabbi is conducting the practice for the service that's coming. And so the cantor, and if you're not familiar with Jewish culture or the culture of the synagogue, you have the rabbi who is kind of like the pastor or the minister, and then you have the cantor, and the cantor is kind of like the worship leader. He's the one who leads the worship and the prayers. And so the cantor is leading the worship, and he stops in the middle of his song, and he begins to beat his chest and look to God, and he goes, I am nothing. I am nothing. I am nothing. And the rabbi is inspired by it. And so then he begins to beat his chest. And he goes, I am nothing. I'm nothing. I am nothing. And there's a janitor in the back sweeping up. And he drops his broom. And he begins to beat his chest. And he goes, I am nothing. I'm nothing. I'm nothing. And the cantor kind of taps the rabbi. And he points to the back of and he goes, look who thinks he's nothing. You know, that is really the picture of who it becomes easy for us to be. Is that we begin to look at the things that God is doing in our lives, and we begin to think that they're all about us and that we're the only one. Paul is combating that idea because look, let's go back and let's look at the last verse of chapter 12. The last verse of 1 Corinthians chapter 12. But earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I show you a more excellent way. See, that's a really key verse right here, because here's what Paul's talking about in 12. Remember, he's talking about spiritual gifts, all the gifts that God has given the body for us to serve each other with. He says, look, you desire the best ones, the ones that you really like, go after, desire those. He says, but I'm going to show you something even better, a more excellent way. Something that's more important, something that's better than whatever gifts you might have. And then he takes us in to chapter 13, and he gives us these 16, I'll call them statements or descriptors of love. He gives us 8 things that love is or does. And then he gives us 8 things that love isn't or doesn't do. And he has them all clumped together. And unless you really take the time to read them individually and sit and think about them, they just become this beautiful statement that doesn't mean anything to us. To really ponder those things, which some would call this meditating on. Meditate on those thoughts, those words, and see what God says to you. Here's what meditation really is. You may have heard me say this before. It's like you have a cup of tea or a cup of hot water, and you take a tea bag and you put the tea bag in the hot water, and then you put a cover over the cup. You know what that's called? That's called steeping. And that's really what meditating on the scripture is you're steeping the scripture. You're taking this Bible verse and you're putting it inside of you, and you're just setting for a few minutes and just thinking about that verse, letting that verse steep inside of you, letting that verse begin to grow and say something to you that it's probably never said before. So, do that this week. with these statements in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, where he gives us this lists of what love is and what love isn't, and what love looks like and what it doesn't look like. And then realize that this is all in the context of him teaching us about spiritual gifts, and so that he's saying gifts are good. Gifts are good things, but there's something even better than gifts. And that's, yeah, you got it, love. and so if he were saying it the way Grandma said it earlier, is that your gifts really aren't complete. Your gifts aren't all that they could be or all they're going to be unless you add love on top of your gift. So, what is love? Right? That becomes at least one of the ultimate questions in this section. So what is love? And we have a definition around Loveland that we like to use for this, and I think it fits perfectly, but here's our definition of the word love. Love seeks the highest good of its object. Love seeks the highest good of its object. Anyone who's a parent, not a parent, but a parent, anyone who's a parent understands this, because most of us do this with our children. Unfortunately, all of us don't, but most of us do, is that we are trying to figure out what is the best thing for our children. I have a friend named Al, and he says this, and I really like it. He says, I am not raising children. I am raising well-adjusted adults. Did you get the difference there? That he's not raising children. He's not trying to help a child to become a better child. He's helping a child to develop into what they're supposed to be when they become adults. And let me tell you, that's love, because it's not always an easy thing, particularly for a child. When you love your wife or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your husband, when you love them, you're seeking the highest good for them. So the question always, or isn't always, trying to give them everything they want, but trying to make sure that they have what is best. So Paul says, I'm going to show you a more excellent way than spiritual gifts. I mean, spiritual gifts are good by themselves, but with love, they're better. With love, everything is better. Jesus is probably the best example of what we're talking about when it comes to love, because he was seeking the highest good for his object. He saw that we were in trouble, that we had a sin problem, and that sin problem was separating us from God. And he was seeking our highest good. And so he left heaven and came down here, and he lived a perfect life on the earth, meaning he never sinned. And that made him worthy to be a sacrifice for us. He was seeking our highest good. And so he lived sacrificially. And then he was killed, died on the cross for our sins. On the third day he rose again, so that we could experience the victory of the resurrection. And so we've defined love. Love seeks the highest good of its object. Now, before I move on to the rest of or some of these other passages, Let me ask you, who do you love like that? Who do you love that you seek their highest good? And that even for that to happen, sometimes you might have to sacrifice. Love isn't easy. Love costs something, doesn't it? Well, Paul begins to give us this list of statements that describe what love is. And he starts with this one. Love suffers long and is kind. Love suffers long and is kind. So let's take the suffers long first. Depending on the translation you have, you might have a Bible translation that says love is, yeah, you know that, patient. And so what does patient mean? It's really the idea of being willing to wait, right? So love is patient. Love is willing to wait. Why? Because I'm seeking the highest good of the person. So when I'm teaching my children or my grandchildren something, my patience is important because they're just learning. And so I'm willing to wait as they learn. I'm going to be patient with them because I want them to be encouraged and built up as they learn this process so that they don't get discouraged and they don't quit. And so I'm being patient. I'm willing to wait. And here's the idea behind patience and being willing to wait is this, that patience really determines how much you value something. Does that make sense to you? See, depending on how valuable something is to you is how long you're willing to wait, how patient you're willing to be. You see the movies where the man is going off to war and the woman, she goes, I'll wait for you. Look, and sometimes she does and sometimes she doesn't, which is where we got the idea of those Dear John letters. But the idea there is that I'll wait for you, that you're worth it to me, you're valuable to me, and because you're so valuable, I am willing to wait. Day after Thanksgiving every year, and it doesn't happen as much now because there's online shopping, but years and years ago, this might be new to some of you, but people would line up outside of stores for days. Literally, they would have a little sleeping bag and a fire and a tent and everything right on the sidewalk outside the store because they were waiting for that Black Friday deal. They were in line, patiently waiting because they really believed what was in that store was valuable. You probably can't see it. Maybe if the camera zooms a little bit, you can see it. But I had a little cut on my face about a week and a half, almost 2 weeks ago now, and that was from a little home improvement accident, and it was small, but it was deep, and so I didn't know whether or not I needed stitches or not, so I went to urgent care, and I stood in line for about 40 minutes in urgent care, and I get to the nurse who is checking people in and checking what their condition is, so I guess so that she could send them to the right places, and with the right priorities. And so she looks and she has her glove on and she pulls my little wound open And she goes, oh yeah, you're going to need probably at least 2 stitches, maybe 3. And I go, okay. And so she goes, okay, here, take your paper, go up to the 2nd floor to waiting area number 1, and they'll call your name. And so I went up, and I sat there. And then I saw kind of on the wall to the other side, there was this list of everyone. So I go up and I look at the list, and I see my name, and then I see who I'm going to see, and then next to it is 3 to 4 hours. Yeah, you got exactly. So wait, I had already been there probably an hour and 15 minutes at that point, and it's going to be another 3 to 4 hours before I get to see someone. Man, that thing will have healed by that time. So I left. Why? Because me seeing that doctor at that moment wasn't as valuable to me as the things that I had to do. And so I just prayed, and I was like, Lord, okay, I believe this is a little cut. And I know she said I need stitches, but I think I'm going to get those butterflies and pinch it together, and pray that it heals well. So Lord, please make this heal well, because I'm not going to sit here and wait another 3 or 4 hours. So, why? Because a little scar right here was not worth it to me. I'd rather have a little, I was weighing the risk. People, you'll hear this term all the time. I took a calculated risk, and usually they didn't. They just decided they're going to do it, and calculated risk is a catchphrase that makes it sound better. So they really didn't calculate anything. They just decided, I'm going to do this. For me, it was a true calculated risk. I was looking at it in the mirror, and I was like, okay, if this turns out to be a scar, what's it going to look like? How big will it be? How noticeable might it be? And all of that. And so I looked at that. I weighed that, what that outcome could be against the outcome of me leaving and finishing what I had to do. And maybe I need to tell you the whole thing so it all makes sense. I was replacing a sink in our kitchen. So we had no kitchen sink. And you know how hard it is to live in a house, and we have a bunch of people in our house right now, to live in our house without a kitchen sink. That's not easy. And so I didn't want us to live like that for another day. And that day was getting late, so I needed to get home and finish the sink. So in my estimation, in my value judgment, going to do that was more important than making sure I wasn't going to have a small scar. So, right or wrong, that was the choice I made. So I wasn't willing to be patient for that. So here's the idea, is that patience really determines how much you value something or someone. See, most of us can't get past that idea of patience, because I want it right now. I want things the way I want them. And you've heard this statement, that patience is a virtue. But let me tell you, patience can also be a crutch. Yeah, patience can be an excuse for weakness. See, patience shows strength and love, but patience can also show weakness and laziness when it's applied the wrong way. Does that make sense? Look, there's a verse in, I think it's Proverbs 22, and it says that I can't go to work today because there's a lion outside. See, so look, people could interpret that, so I'm going to patiently sit here until the lion leaves. And the idea behind that verse is, look, that lion outside is really just the excuse you're using to not do what you're supposed to do. Yeah. And so patience can be a crutch, but then patience, we know it to be a virtue. When you're trying to figure something out and someone is patient with you, man, that makes you feel good, doesn't it? Think about when someone's impatient with you, when you're trying to do some, look, you're stopped at the light, supposed to be turning left, right? And the car behind you starts honking his horn. See, he's being impatient. Does that feel good? No. So the idea of patience being a virtue, that patience tells us how much we value something. Okay, I didn't get anywhere near where I thought we were going to get today. So we're going to pick this up next week at this same spot. So, but let's just recap real quickly. What did we get? The first thing we got was a definition for love. And what's that definition? That love seeks the highest good for its object. And what's the next thing that we got? We talked about patience, and really what determines whether or not we're going to be patient or not. And that's the value we put on the thing that we're being patient for. So those are the two things that we got today. We'll get a bunch more next time. God bless you.